Hope that you're doing well on this Wednesday evening as we continue our study through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings under the rise and the ruin of Israel. And we're currently seeing Israel on the rise. David has just passed its greatest monarch, and now his son Solomon has taken over in the fulfillment of 2nd Samuel chapter 7. And the first two chapters we've seen in the first chapter, there was Adonijah, the son, trying to usurp the throne, and Solomon is stated by David to be his successor, and he comes to the throne even while Adonijah is preparing in backdoor deals to perform basically a coup. And then in chapter 2, which we looked at last week, David actually passes and gives his final charge to David, and then passes from this life and gives him a charge concerning the things that he should do if he wants to be faithful as a king and he wants God to prosper him, and the things that he needs to do for certain individuals to kind of tie up loose ends and to protect the kingdom. And so then the rest of the chapter is kind of a fallout from all of that advice and what happens and how we got to a point. But the chapter ended with Solomon on the throne. The kingdom was firmly established in the hand of Solomon. And so where we come now in chapter 3, we learn about the origin of Solomon's wisdom. Wisdom, even for a person who isn't very familiar with Scripture, they're many times very familiar with Solomon, and Solomon is many times synonymous with wisdom. Sometimes he's synonymous with some more negative things, but that's a little bit later. This chapter is focusing on his wisdom. Now, what's interesting about this is when you study the first couple of kings, when you look at Saul and you look at David, especially David, Saul not so much, but they were similar kings. Israel was a smaller nation. They weren't really a national superpower yet. And David really expanded the borders of the kingdom. And so David and Saul were more like warrior kings. But what was needed now was not so much a warrior king, but an administrative king, one that could organize everything. And with the conquering and the annexation of other nations, they needed someone who could be a great administrator, who could draw things up, could get everyone organized and together, realize and develop a tax system that could help them as they tried to move forward as a nation, because they wouldn't be conquering other nations. They would simply be existing as they were. So they would need some kind of a tax organization to help them fund the things of the state. They would need infrastructure. They need a lot of building projects. And of course, that's what Solomon is going to do. And so we see him here, and we learn about the origin of his wisdom. And so as we think about this chapter, let's walk through it. The chapter divides into two sections. The first 15 verses deal with the account where God appears to Solomon in a dream by night, and Solomon seeks wisdom from the Lord. And then in verses 16 through 28, we see the application of that wisdom with a scenario that is presented to him as he sits upon the throne to make a judgment. So let's begin, first of all, with the origin of his wisdom, or his heavenly wisdom. It says, Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. And so we're told at the very beginning that he's making a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, there are a number of moving parts here. And so he ends up taking Pharaoh's daughter to be his wife. Now, obviously, that's a marital alliance. Now, what's interesting is that Pharaohs didn't often marry off their daughters in alliances. And so it may be that it shows that Egypt is a little bit weaker at this point, and Solomon has the upper hand, and he is really becoming an international sensation, and people understand him to be an international power. And so the fact that Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh may be that Pharaoh, and you could make an argument the other way, that Solomon in some way would be subservient to Pharaoh. But I think here the point is that in marrying the daughter of Pharaoh, Pharaoh is actually seeking peaceful terms with Israel, because he understands that Israel is a force to be reckoned with at this particular point. Now, we also struggle with a number of things. Because one of the things God, when he gave the laws concerning kings in Deuteronomy 17, of course, they did not have them yet. he said, but I know that what's going to happen when you get in the land, you're going to want a king. And so I'm going to go ahead and give you the laws that are going to govern who the king should be and how he should operate, Deuteronomy 17 at the end of that chapter. And one of the things he strictly forbids is the returning to Egypt, especially in the area of horses, which Solomon will violate. Every one of these rules Solomon will violate almost to an nth degree. And so here he is returning to Egypt, which is something that God does not want them to do. And so there's a troublesome issue there on the front end. There's also the fact that he marries Pharaoh's daughter and she's a Gentile. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, God had said, when you go into the promised land, I don't want you to intermarry with the individuals and the nations that are there. And he lists 7 nations. And so his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter as a Gentile is troublesome on that front. Now, the way Jews defended it, especially in that day, was this. Of the 7 nations that were mentioned in Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 4, Egypt was not one of the nations mentioned. However, it does seem to be that what God is saying in Deuteronomy 7 is not just do not intermarry with these 7 nations, but rather don't intermarry with Gentile nations, period. That seems to be the overall emphasis of what's being said in Deuteronomy chapter 7. So his intermarriage with Pharaoh's daughter here is troublesome on the front end, especially in his walk with God. And as some people have suggested, this may be a prelude into some of the things. Obviously, they're going to get him into trouble later in 1 Kings chapter 11 when we get there about his final years of reign and his demise and what ultimately will lead to a fracturing of the kingdom. And so those are a number of things that are going on that we have to cipher through and try and figure out. But we do know that Solomon is reaching international fame and influence if he is already in this process of making alliances. So it says that he takes her and he brings her into the city of David until he had finished building. Okay, so he brings her into the city, but it doesn't seem that she lived in the palace of David, because in 2 Chronicles chapter 8 and verse 11, it gives us the idea that Solomon did not allow her to live in that palace, the place where the Ark of the Covenant had been. And also in this same book in 1 Kings 7 and 1 Kings 9, it describes the special home that he built for Pharaoh's daughter. And so for whatever that is worth, that is something that Solomon is doing here. Now it says he brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house, the house of the Lord, and the wall around Jerusalem. Now, Solomon is going to have a ton of building projects, and you see some of them listed there. His own house, his palace, which is going to take several years, and we'll run into that a little bit later. The temple of the Lord, which will be a bulk of his reign when we get to, say, chapters 6, 7, and 8. We'll watch the plans for the temple and the construction of the temple and the dedication of the temple. And so he's going to do that building project, but also the walls around Jerusalem. You have to remember, Jerusalem as an Israelite possession is rather new, because it was only captured in the days of David, 2 Samuel chapter 5. And so it's going to continue to expand, and Solomon is going to lead that expansion and put the walls up around the city of Jerusalem. And so he's there moving and doing these particular things. Then in verse 2, it says, the people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. That is, the temple had not been built yet. Now, when we think about high places, they many times are up, obviously, on mountains or on plateaus or hills. And anyone who's had just even a somewhat minimal interaction with the Old Testament can probably tell you that they're familiar with these hills and that they are not always in a positive connotation. As a matter of fact, the majority of time, maybe the only way we've ever heard them is in a negative connotation. This is where idolatry took place. They would worship their idols on every high mountain and under every green tree, the way the prophets would put it on some occasions. And so, and even in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, the high places are seen and evaluated. Kings are evaluated on their relationships to the high places. But what we have to understand is the high places themselves do not always indicate that it was idolatry. Okay. For an example, in 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10, Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 9 is pictured as coming from the high place in order to offer his sacrifice to God. Or the sons of the prophet coming down from the offering sacrifices in the high places in 1 Samuel chapter 10. Or even when in 2 Chronicles 33, there was a reformation going on in the days of Josiah. The high places were taken away, or were not taken away, but only the Lord was worshiped in those places. And so when we see Solomon here and the other Israelites still worshiping at the high places, it does not necessarily imply idolatry. It could. And some people certainly read it and interpret it that way. And that's okay. I don't necessarily agree with that assessment. I do believe that Solomon here is not, I don't believe he's an idolater here. I believe he's actually offering sacrifices to the Lord. And when you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 1, in the opening 8 verses, it kind of gives us that idea as well, that he is worshiping the Lord in these locations. So there's some things going on there, and we have to understand there are going to be some differences of opinions. But mine is that this is not idolatry that he or the children of Israel are engaged in, although they had a history of it. Now, verse 3, it says, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. Okay, so he loves the Lord. He's beloved by the Lord. That's one of the names that the Lord gave him at his own birth in 2 Samuel chapter 12. You remember, he's the son that was born to David and Bathsheba after the death of the first son born to David and Bathsheba, which was, that child was conceived through adultery. And in the process of time for punishment, that child ended up dying. Now, it says he made, as we said, he made the offerings and sacrifices in the high places, and he went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Now, when the children of Israel initially entered the promised land, the tabernacle, which had been with them all throughout the wilderness journeys and wanderings, was placed in the city of Shiloh. Okay, we see that in a number of places. For an example, Jeremiah chapter 7, when the children of Israel, or excuse me, the people of Judah, the 10 northern tribes of Israel are already in captivity, but when the people of Judah are believing that captivity is not going to come upon them, even though Jeremiah has told them that Babylon is coming, they're refusing to believe it. And they say, because we've got the temple. And God said, that doesn't really matter. Go down to Shiloh and see what I did to the place that used to house my place of worship, the tabernacle. And so Shiloh was a place, but it seems as if when we look, for an example, at 2 Chronicles chapter 1 and verse 3, or at 1 Chronicles 16 verses 39 through 40, that the tabernacle had come to be located in the city of Gibeon, which was, depending upon which source you read, between 4 and 7 miles north of Jerusalem, up on a plateau in which you could get kind of a panoramic view of Israel. You could see for miles at the top of this location. And so Solomon is going here to sacrifice. And it says Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar, again, to the Lord, 1 Chronicles chapter 1, or 2 Chronicles 1, 5 through 6. And so he's engaged in the worship of God. Now, what's interesting is this location, because no doubt as he goes up to offer his worship on this high place, and in these high places, they would have their altars and they would have certain structures there, not necessarily a building, but it would be some kind of a platform that would hold a place to make the offering. And so they would go up. You can imagine Solomon going up and making these offerings, but also looking out over the vastness of what is the nation of Israel that's now under his control. And he himself is a relatively young man. We know that he's obviously married at this point. The events of chapters 3 and 4 actually take place during the first 3 to 4 years of his reign, because in 1 Kings chapter 6, he begins the process of building the temple, and we're given a timestamp on that building date, and the timestamp is that he began that building process in the 4th year of his reign. And so it's somewhere between the first 3 and 4 years of his reign that we're looking at in this particular setting. So Solomon has had a chance to worship. He's had a chance to take in all that he is responsible for as a king. And then this happens. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, ask what I shall give you. And Solomon said, you have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. That's that same promise of 2 Samuel 7. And so Solomon is he knows and understands the history of what God has done with his father. And so verse 7, he says, and now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in the place of David my father, although I am but a little child. Talking about and referencing, he is a young man, but also a very green king. This is not something that he's been groomed for it in a way, but you never really are fully prepared until you step into that position and really feel the weight of it and everything that is in front of you. And so he says, I'm like a child. I do not know how to go out or to come in. Now, to go out or to come in is an expression that's used several times in the Old Testament. You see it in Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua and 1 Samuel and in some other locations, but it describes, at the very minimum, the daily habits of leadership, to come in and to go out, to lead people in and out. Okay. Now, it may have a more specific focus, especially into as far as military terms, because when you study it in its context, the phrase sometimes has reference, especially to the idea of leading a military. But at the very least, it does have to do with the administrative day-to-day things involved in leading a nation. And so he's saying, I'm overwhelmed by what's in front of me. The task before me is too big. And so with that, he says, verse 8, and your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for a multitude. And so he says, based upon my inexperience and based upon the greatness of your people and the vastness of your people, this is what I ask. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people? And so he says, I want an understanding mind, the ESV translates. A more literal translation would be, give me a listening or an obedient heart. A listening and an obedient heart. The idea is that of listening to the voice of God and then obeying what the voice of God says. So walking in a way that is consistent with the ways of God. That's the kind of heart I'll give me, a wise heart. And so when we think about wisdom, especially as you draw it from the Proverbs, which is a focus on upon wisdom, divine wisdom. And so when you look at wisdom, it has a prudence element, a common sense, knowing how to navigate things that happen. It has obviously an understanding of God's will, but also a submission and a practice to it. The word wisdom is sometimes used and associated, especially in Exodus. The word you see, the Hebrew term itself, is associated with skilled artisans, skilled workers. And so being skillful in the application and understanding of the revelation of God, that's the idea of wisdom, to know how to take what it is that God has revealed and how to do it, and then how to make sure, of course, in Solomon's position, that he administers justice, that he can discern between good and evil, that he can know the difference between right and wrong. And in each given situation, he will know what he should do. And that is a wisdom that he desperately needs. And that's why he's searching for it. And so what you see in Solomon is a desire to be a leader. He desires to step into that position, and he desires to lead, and is not focused on himself. Now, later he's going to make that mistake, but right now he's not focused on himself. He's worried about how his own insufficiencies might harm the people for whom he is responsible, that ultimately belong to God. And so he feels the weight of the responsibility. Now, what Solomon asked, of course, verse 10, it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this, and not asked for yourself long life or riches, or for the lives of your enemies, but have asked for yourself an understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. And so God respects the fact that he doesn't ask for a long life or riches or for the lives of his enemies, the things that you would expect people to ask for. But because your focus was about servant leadership. He says, because of that, behold, verse 12, I will give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. You're going to be the wisest man this world has ever seen. Now, obviously, none had risen before him, and none would rise after him in the sense of a human king. Obviously, Jesus would supersede that as God in the flesh. And he would say in Matthew chapter 12, and this we'll get to a little bit more in depth when we come to 1 Kings chapter 10, when the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon. But Jesus would say that the Queen of the South would rise up in judgment with that generation to whom Jesus was speaking and condemn it, because she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, a greater than Solomon is here. Specifically with a focus on his wisdom and his rule. And so when he says none will arise after you, obviously there is the exception to that. Jesus, which will be God in the flesh, will be the only exception to that. So his wisdom, and it's what we associate with Solomon even to this day. So God says, I've given it to you. And we're going to see it throughout these first 11 chapters more and more. And then he says this in verse 13, I give you also for what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. I'm going to make you the wealthiest king the world has seen. And that's true. We're going to see that unfold in these coming chapters. We're going to see the absolute and utter wealth of Solomon come to the forefront. And though he says, and if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And so one, he says, I'm going to make you wealthy. And in the other, he says, if you're obedient, I'll give you a long life. Verse 15, then Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. The Ark of the Covenant, you remember, is in Jerusalem. That's what David did, 2 Samuel chapter 6. But now, and even though the tabernacle seems to be at Gibeon, the Ark of the Covenant is still in Jerusalem. And so it says, then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings and made a feast for all his servants. So there's this sense of obviously worship, but celebration of what God has promised to him, but also the sense of covenant, that they have entered into an understanding and these promises with one another, that God has made promises to Solomon, and Solomon has promised to be obedient to God. And so it's almost as a covenant meal as well, which you can see when you study throughout the Old Testament, that meals were often associated with covenants. So there's the wisdom of Solomon coming to him. But then in the process of time, he's presented with a case that will earn him international fame because of how he handles it. And so the story begins, verse 16, then two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. Now, obviously, prostitution, harlotry was sinful, always has been and always will be. But what you see here was Solomon taking this particular case. I think there are two things in particular. Number one, a vested interest in making sure justice is administered, which is in keeping with a psalm that he wrote, Psalm 72, about how kings should rule. It might be good to go and read that, by the way, in connection with the things that are going on here and in connection to Solomon's life in general in these first 11 chapters. And so, but it also shows that he is there for the social outcast and the downtrodden. Because those who had gone into prostitution, especially in this culture, they did so many times in hopes of survival. It's because they couldn't really find anything else. You have to remember, this is not a time when women go out and just apply for jobs and they get them and they can support themselves. And so many times they end up in prostitution as their last hope of making a living, of being able to eat, basically, not even really making a living, just being able to eat. And so they're very low on the social scale. And of course, they're always going to be outcast. And again, that's not to justify what they do, But it does show you that Solomon is interested in justice straight across the board, and that he's taking this particular case. And so here's the complaint. Then one woman said, "Oh, my Lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone." Now, what that means when we were alone is there are going to be no witnesses. And so that's going to put Solomon in what would be a predicament, because we don't have any witnesses to rely upon. It's a she said situation. He says, "There was no one else with us in the house. Only we two were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him." So she rolled on him in some way and smothered her child. Obviously not purposefully, but in accident. And she says, "And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. When I arose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had born." But the other woman said, "No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours." The first said, "No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine." Thus they spoke before the king. And so you see this back and forth and back and forth, and there are no witnesses. Again, she said versus she said. Verse 23, what's Solomon going to do? Well, the king said, "This one says that this is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. The other says, no, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one." And the king said, "Bring me a sword." So a sword was brought to the king. And the king said, "Divide the living child in two, and give the half to one and the half to the other." Now, obviously, Solomon has zero intention of killing this child, zero. But he's trying to see, what he's doing is exercising this wisdom given from God. He wants to see the reactions, because the reactions will tell him about who the mother is. And so, verse 26, then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, "Oh, my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death." And so the woman who really was the mother of the living child said, "No, I would rather him be with her and alive than to be dead, and both of us have a portion." But the other said, "He shall neither be mine nor yours, divide him." Which shows you something about just the harshness and the callousness of this woman to kill a child and really have no. And so it's really not hard to see who the legitimate mother here is. The real mother would want her child to stay alive. So, verse 27, the king answered and said, "Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is the mother." And so, obviously, based upon the reactions, he knew who the mother was. And so that's the way he administered justice. Verse 28, and all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was with him to do justice. Because they knew that Solomon would be a faithful king, and that he would not be one that could be fooled very easily. The wisdom of God was resting upon him, and even in the most difficult of cases, he was going to come out and know exactly what to do, and the person who perpetrated the crime would not get away, and the innocent would be vindicated, the very idea of justice. So what we see then is kind of a reiteration of what was said at the end of chapter 2. The kingdom is firmly established in the hands of Solomon. He has the kingdom. He doesn't really have any external threats, no more internal threats. And now God is just prospering him, because he has asked in humility for wisdom to lead God's people, and God has granted him that wisdom, and now he is using that wisdom and will continue to use that wisdom. And so what we're going to see as we continue to walk through this is how Solomon continues to prosper, and God continues to use him for his glory and for the good of his people. But ultimately, as we always remember, Solomon is pointing us to someone far greater, which is Jesus. Jesus wouldn't have needed a sword to read the reactions of the two mothers. He would have read their hearts. He knew, as we studied in John over the last few months, he knew what was in man already. And he himself said, "A greater than Solomon is here." And so Solomon, even in all of his glory, we still see mistakes. We still see him making foreign alliances and having foreign wives, which is something that God said should not happen. And so even when we see the goodness of Solomon, it's still, some of that is offset by the weaknesses of Solomon. But when we come to Jesus, we see no weakness. And so that's one of the things we said in the very beginning of this study, that Solomon and these kings would show us the need for a perfect king. And of course, no human being would be able to do that. Only Jesus would be able to do that when he came to us in the flesh. And so we hope you'll continue to be with us as we walk through this study together and watch God work through the life of Solomon.